Hey now, Rob here, Rob School of Music, and we got a special episode for you guys today. We're talking to someone who got to know for over 25 years the reason why a lot of us actually play guitar. Mr. Steve Rosen wrote this incredible book, Tone Chaser, and it's about his experience knowing Mr. Edward Van Halen.
Oh, Rob, thank you so much, man. I'm really excited.
Me too, man.
And your school, you know, the music thing is, I think that's fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Ed was a big proponent of that, as you know, and yeah, man, I think, yeah, you know, take up a guitar and you're not going to pick up a gun. I mean, I'm being a little glib here, but I mean, you know, music really is the great communicator, right? We all understand it. We don't have to know what the words are, but you know, we're all touched by that thing. So.
Dude, it's so true, and I see that with young musicians every day. I mean, I think the best part of my job and the job of my my team here at Rob School of Music is every week we get to turn some young musician onto Van Halen or Zeppelin or the Beatles, and we just get to watch and relive those initial emotions that all of us experienced when we found those bands the first time. I'm perpetually, I think, a 17-year-old for the rest of my life because I'm just constantly living my 17-year-old life over and over. That's actually why this book, when I saw the press about it, everyone was talking about it. This was the book to get. And then, I was so happy to get my hands on one, and you guys can get one. We'll put links in the show notes about where you can get your copy. But just this perspective of someone who got to hang out with, Edward Van Halen and know him in the beginning, and it's so many details, and it's your story too, which is kind of a cool parallel as your friendship, up and down and so on. So I think the best way to do this is just, how did you meet him, and just go from there?
Yeah, man. I want to touch on one thing you said before I start running some chronology. When I actually sat down to write the book, I honestly, I didn't look or think it was going to be my story at all. Look, it was going to be written in first person. It was me looking at these things. You were going to see things through my eyes. But in no way did I want it to come out as a memoir or as I just thought that would have, I don't know. It struck me as being, I don't know what the word is, tacky, or who's really going to be interested in me when I'm in the room with Edward Van Halen. But it's because of those things that, I was a guitar player in my own right. I played enough to not be very good and not be too terrible, So I had that, I was a journalist, and I was Edward's friend, So I guess those three things come together, and that's what I think people picked up on. But my initial idea really was to sort of almost be this faceless entity in the background. So in addressing your question, and I go over in my mind and I try to think about this. Everybody in Hollywood knew the band Van Halen. I mean, they knew them from the Pasadena backyard parties, and then moving to the Strip, and playing Gazzarri's, and then Starwood and the Whiskey. And the thing I write about in the book that is just so strange to me, and I can't imagine how it happened, is that I never saw Van Halen play. I mean, I was at the Whiskey a lot, man. And the Starwood. I mean, I was there all the time, and I'd seen all these other bands, like the precursor to Autograph, Y&T, and Dave Meniketti famously, provides a pretty interesting quote at the end of the book. So Y&T were there, all the time, But for some reason, I'd never seen Van Halen. So I'm at the Whiskey. It's a Thursday or a Friday night, and I'm there because Cheap Trick are recording a live record. I was getting a lot of invitations to the Whiskey, and it's just the way the record industry was back in the day. They really courted writers, man. They wanted you to come and hang out and have a drink and write a review or do an interview. And I was pretty selective in the kind of bands I like. I wasn't into the punk thing at all. So that didn't interest me. And that's what mainly, those are the types of bands that were playing the whiskey, around that time, mid 77. But I thought, Cheap Trick recording a live record, the whiskey, that's worth seeing. So got in the car with my brother, so we drive over to the whiskey, and we're down on the floor. We're waiting for Cheap Trick to come on. And there's a tap on my shoulder. I turn around, and it's Michelle Meyer. Michelle was the girl who booked the whiskey. She also booked Madame Wong's East and West, which are two pretty very hip kind of punk clubs. I had a band called Deluge at the time. That wasn't. We weren't amazing, but it wasn't a bad band. I was a songwriter. And my first love, really, I wanted to be in a rock and roll band and play guitar. I mean, who didn't, But, I mean, the band wasn't great, but we were pretty good. Somehow I had befriended Michelle, and she booked us into Madame Wong's East and West, without ever hearing the band. So I owed her. I loved Michelle. She was so great. And like I write about, man, she was a rock and roll yenta. She knew everything. She knew everything that was worth knowing. So she says, listen, man, there's this guy here, the guitar player, you got to meet this guy, and I didn't know who it was. She didn't tell me. So I walk upstairs, and again, it's another moment in time that I'm trying to remember. I walk in, one of the dressing rooms, and I see him, and I'm trying to remember, do I recognize this guy? Have I seen his face on posters? I mean, right, there's no internet, obviously. There's no albums out. This is 77. They're not signed yet. I mean, I don't even know if there's been any stories on them. I don't even know if I recognize them. She says, Steve Rosen, Eddie Van Halen. I go, Van Halen. I knew the name Van Halen, getting back to my original point. They were pretty heavy, having played the whiskey, Starwood, they were like this, the open door, they now gave these other bands, Hollywood strip bands, thinking, wow, these guys are from Pasadena and they were playing the whiskey and they got signed out of Starwood. We can do it too. So, she introduces me, and introduces, Eddie Van Halen, Godhead, her description as the greatest thing ever. And we just start talking, and it's one of those conversations. And God, I wish I had my cassette player back then, but I try to recall that moment, and it just felt so good. And he was so perfectly at ease with himself, And again, I hadn't heard him play. I didn't know how truly amazing he was. But, at the same time that he was at ease with himself, he had this self-confidence that I just thought was so unbelievable. As someone who's never had a lot of self-confidence in what he did, I just looked at that and I thought, God, the guy's just so sure of himself, man. But he's not in my face. He's not like saying, man, we got a deal on Warner's. He was just an unbelievably caring guy, and he wanted to hear about me, and we were talking about bands we loved, and Clapton comes up, and Blackmore, who would famously play a part in the book later on, as you all know, if you've read the book. So that was the first time I met Ed. I think that's June 77. I would interview him the first time in December of that year. The first record comes out, January 78, February 78. So again, I interview him before the record comes out. And yeah, man, the thing just grows from there. And I think it was because maybe I didn't know how amazing he was, that maybe I wasn't intimidated by just sitting and talking with him. I mean, I'd met some very heavy guitar players, and I don't think intimidated was the right word, but, I'd sat there and I'd already met Blackmore and John McLaughlin and, Joe Walsh and John Edwards. So, I mean, I met some heavy guys, Jeff Beck. Yeah, I think that had a big part to do with it. Not having heard the record, I think in some ways may have helped. And it just grew from this guy that, had a record deal into becoming Edward Van Halen, this, like you say, man, this iconic guitar player who changed forever, the face and the sound of electric guitar.
As your interviews began to happen more and more, did his, because you always see him, you know, he's so smiley as he performs and he just seems so approachable. I have a couple questions about that. I guess the first one was, is as, you know, the first record comes out, the second record, because they, you know, for those who are watching this, who aren't sure, or younger musicians, like in the beginning, it was just record. They're incredibly prolific those first handful of years as a band, which, you know, him as a songwriter, as the primary guy, you know, composing the music. Did he ever appear like the pressure, the stress was getting to him? Was he enjoying the fame as it was occurring? Like, what was that energy like?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. I can tell you with just about 100% certainty, probably those first two records, the first two tours for Edward, were his favorite times. I mean, he was just, every moment he was smiling and buoyant, and you know, obviously the reception to the records. The Warners didn't place a lot of confidence in them, thinking that they're not going to sell anywhere near as well as they sold. But yeah, man, he was, you know, because for him it was all a new experience, right? You're going from, you know, playing the Starwood, you know, to you know, touring, and even if you are opening, you know, or you know, you're out there with these pretty big bands. So for him, it must have just been unbelievably life-changing, and I felt it. Yeah, you know, I could just, he was just so, just doing absolutely what he should have been doing, you know, and I think he loved recording, and you know, some of the cracks that would maybe appear later. I mean, I think some of those fissures were probably there from the beginning, but with him, it just, it never got in his way. He was really happy those first two tours. To probably extended, you know, to the third record, fourth record. But by then, pressure, you know, he was feeling pressure. As you mentioned, the sole songwriter. You know, nobody else wrote a note of music. You know, nobody else. You know, Dave came up with lyrics, of course, and melodies. But yeah, being the sole songwriter was a tough thing, and they were prolific. And as we all know, over the course of their career, their output was minimal. I mean, for a band who'd been around that long, and I don't know what the album count is. I'm sure you would know better than me, but yeah, it went down to zero. You know, things changed in Edward's life. You know, obviously later on, having Wolfgang, you know, I think the drug thing, the drinking thing, you know, the split with Dave. But yeah, early on he was, you know, if he was the most, he was just so, that certainty he had about himself, it was just, God, you just stood next to the guy and it's like, I don't know, man, you know, I'm not a spiritual guy or anything, but it's like you felt this unbelievable energy, you know, just positive energy. And he cared about you and, hey, how are you doing, man? And, wow. You know, it was never, oh, man, our fucking record's great. He never talked like that, you know. And, you know, people, you know, bash him a little bit maybe for talking maybe poorly about some other guitar players. I don't know, man. Maybe some of those other guitar players deserve that because they trashed Edward. But, yeah, man, the early days, oh, I'm sorry, man.
It's all good.
Forgive me. Yeah, man, the early days were everything for him. Yeah.
In the beginning, and I guess maybe just to build out some context here. So as you're building this friendship with him along the way, and just, I mean, these endless tapes of just real, genuine, sincere conversations. And that's probably like my favorite part about the book is how it's like when you have the sections where it's just like he said, then you said, like a dialogue almost. Yeah. That's awesome because it's like you're it's like when that Peter Jackson put out that Beatles thing. It's like it's like forbidden almost. It's like you've unzipped a pocket reality and now you've stepped into a time you're in a fly in the wall experiencing something which is so incredibly generous for you to be able to share that with, all of us who would never have had those experiences. How did you build up that trust? Because I think one of the questions that a lot of the students here ask as they see my experience musically and in touring and things, and when you are befriending a musician that you are inspired by or look up to, and obviously you met him towards the beginning of his journey, but just in general, like, when does this switch shift from interviewer, interviewee to, okay, we're friends, we're just talking? Like, how did that happen?
I wish I could say, it was like 1982 and I'd known him for 5 years, man. And, and I know exactly what you're asking. And I've thought about it so much. And, it's funny because my brother read the book, and my brother is like my harshest critic. I mean, and he said, well, Steve, all of a sudden, he's come over to your house and now you're going up to his house and you're good friends with him. Where's that, and it's like, man, I'm trying here, I suppose it's that way with any friendship, when does that last drop fill the glass and does it overflow? You watch and you watch, it doesn't overflow, and all of a sudden it's overflowed and you're now friends with this person. You've gone from that, close acquaintance, to a friend. I guess a huge part of it, and one of the most important words I know is respect. Man, I think it's easy to love somebody, but you can love somebody without respecting them. I think, earning respect and giving respect, man, that is a hard thing to do. I had such respect for him, not only because of his talent, because of his success, but because he was always, like I said, so open about his feelings, and he always was willing to give of himself. I just had so much respect for someone who could be at the top of the food chain and just have those kinds of qualities. Man, I've met a lot of guitar players, and there's been a lot of very nice guys, but I've seen a lot of them really affected by that, and rightly so. How can you not be, man? You're surrounded by people who want to give you everything, and the world loves you. So for him to keep that balance was amazing. I think maybe that got a little skewed later on. And answer to your question, I don't know when that is. Look, my approach to interviewing has always been sort of coming from a fan, because I've always, not always, but I'd say 90% of the interviews I've done were bands that I wanted to interview. Look, a lot of times, back in the day when you're a beginning freelancer, they'll say, hey, well, you can interview Steely Dan if you interview Dr. Hook. And no offense to Dr. Hook, but Dr. Hook wasn't my favorite band. But, it's like, still Dr. Hook had something to say, and I was always, interested going in. So I always tried to approach it, one, from a fan standpoint. What does that person want to know who's not sitting here? Two, as a guitar player and musician and songwriter, I knew the mechanics of all of that stuff. I didn't play nearly as well as any of those guys, but I understood how to write a song and chord changes and, major, I knew all that stuff. So I could bring that to bear. And also, I tried to be conversational about it, And so maybe Ed picked up on those things. Maybe he felt comfortable in my company. At a point in time, he realized I was someone he could confide in. I wasn't going to betray that trust, and I never did.
An ally.
I held on to that stuff for 20 years, 17 years. So yeah, I wish I could give you an answer, man. I would say, honestly, by 70 years, probably by 79, a couple of years. I think I would have called us friends. Yeah. He'd call and I'd call, and I don't think it would have been incorrect to say, yeah, Edward Van Halen is my friend, you know? So,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
it comes across that way. And again, I really feel like that's what makes this such a unique, work to have out there, is just from that perspective where it's you're both, right? You're interviewing and you're gathering information, but you're also shooting the shit. And I think being able to do both seamlessly, weaving in and out, is a pretty cool thing to be able to do. On the musical side of things, I guess in my mind, you see him noodling, constantly noodling. Was there a guitar always in his hands?
Honestly, we talk about that, as a joke, but every single time I saw him, he had a guitar in his hands. He would come over to the house, and if he hadn't brought one of his guitars, which I write about, I had my guitars, and I read about this. I had my guitar sort of set up in my living room. The little guest house that I described when we part way was very small. I think it was like 700 square feet or 600, but it was cool, and the bedroom was sort of a sunken room in the back, and there was no room to put it back there. And it's not like I had a separate office or anything. So they were kind of always set up in the front room, which is where you walked in the door. So, as soon as you walk in, they'd be in a stand, and pretty much the time I knew I had the Strat, which I talk about, and a Les Paul, and he'd go over and pick up typically the Strat. And yeah, man, he'd sit down and he'd tune it up, and he'd say, hey, can I do this or that, and he'd start noodling, and he'd light his cigarette, and the smoke, and, I'm gagging, but honestly, he really did have a guitar in his hand all the time. And certainly whenever I went up there, I'd come in the studio and he was sitting in the booth with a guitar, or he was standing up with a guitar. And the guitars were always all around, in stands, not in stands. People have sort of asked me a question. This is sort of a peripheral subject, Rob. Well, what do you think, if you guys had met and he hadn't been a guitar player, do you think you would have still been friends? My answer to that is, I would like to think so. I think we would be. But the other side of that is, Edward could never have been anything but a musician. I don't know what he could have been. What, was he going to work in a bank, or was he going to be a mailman, or honestly, I don't know. I don't know what else could be. So it's one of those perfect things. You think about those people at that level, and I think of Jeff Beck. Could Jeff Beck have been anything but a guitar player? And a lot of those guys went to art school, but that was just a springboard. So yeah, for him having a guitar in his hand, what was as natural as, yeah, him having the cigarette, or somebody else not having a guitar in his hand.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, what else would he have been? Because I feel like, as an educator, I interact with people every day, and every so often someone will come through my door here, and you could just tell, like, this person, they're made of music. That's the phrase I use, because that's I'm not even close to Eddie Van Halen, but I think I'm made of music. I can't imagine myself doing anything else. I just had to give a presentation at my old high school, giving a scholarship, and I made a joke saying, like, how if you knew me 25 years ago, you'd have thought, oh, this kind of makes sense that he's still that guy, so that's cool. And it's completely accurate. You like, what was he going to do? He's not going to be a stockbroker. It just doesn't add up.
No.
But
yeah, funny.
As he had, these guitars, the Frankenstrat, and the black and yellow one, and the chopped up Explorer or Destroyer or whatever it was, like,
yeah.
Did you ever get to play them? And what did they feel like? Because I've heard stories that people grabbing these guitars and the setups were atrocious and things were terrible. And it just, is that your experience as well?
Oh my God. I thought I was going to, take one of his guitars and play like Eddie Van Halen. It didn't happen. But yeah, and I write about in the book, I played the yellow and black one. He brings over the Bumblebee guitar. I'm pretty sure I played the Frankenstrat up at 5150. And he always had those other miscellaneous guitars around. I think I might have played the V, the famous V on the cover of that first Guitar World story I wrote. The Bumblebee, because at that point I think that's the story where we switched guitars, and I thought, oh, this, I'm gonna play his guitar, and I'm thinking it was horrible. I mean, the action felt high, and again, as little as I played, I was always used to like a floating vibrato bar. His you could only push down, and it was like, it takes two hands to push it down. They played horribly. They didn't play well at all. I had played guitars from some other guys. I played one of Yngwie's Strats once, and that played pretty easy. I played one of Brian May's guitars.
Wow.
And his heavy string is an 8. I mean, it was like you couldn't even feel the strings under your fingers. But and you think of Ed and the way he played, and I mean, he was a really, in my mind, his attack and his picking technique was really heavy. It was not like this delicate thing, man. And watching him up close, I realized how hard he picked. But just the nuances of it and his control, and was just something else. But yeah, man, I thought his guitars played like shit.
Yeah, I think that's incredible to me. And just for anyone watching this, like a lot of the things I'm asking about, this is all in the book. I'm just setting up the question so we can get into it. But you want to know more about the stuff, you get this book because it's killer. It's funny with him, his picking hand. I have a poster in one of the rooms here at the school of Dave doing the split in the air and Eddie doing his thing. And when I always reference it when I'm teaching a kid how to hold a guitar pick, because I always say to kind of hold it between these two fingers and keep your hand parallel to the like strings, like you could high five it. And he was always up like this. And I'm like, music is full of a 1,000 suggestions, very few absolutes. And no one was going to tell Edward Van Halen that's a weird way to hold your pick because he made it sing. That's so cool.
Exactly, Rob. And then, holding it between, I don't have a pick here, but between these, the flutter thing, I watched him do that. And I was like, oh my God. Yeah. Yeah, no, he was unique. Yeah. And that's the other thing that, we don't forget about, but yeah, the fact that he's building his own guitars, and playing his own guitars and hearing the sound and creating the guitar. Actually, I've always been curious, and maybe I talk about it in the book, what came first? I think he probably must have heard something in his head and, was building the guitars to reproduce that sound, as opposed to building a guitar, hearing the sound, and then, thinking, oh, that's my sound. You know what I mean? I think somehow he from listening to, all the Clapton, Cream tracks, and Blackmore and the Marshall thing and, his other influences, but to hear it and then to build it and to have the guitar, recreate what you're hearing in your head, that's like a real step beyond for me. I mean, that's creating something. That's creating a whole universe.
And I agree with that entirely. I've actually had heated conversations with friends of mine about that topic because, he was a trendsetter. He changed the game and a lot of people copied things he was doing. If you were to fast forward in time, another guitar player, totally different style, but someone who innovated and changed things would be Tom Morello. Tom Morello did a lot of things where he's tapping on the input jack and the whammy pedal and everything. I think, and this is my argument with my friends, the difference between the two is Van Halen was hearing something in his brain and then manifesting something to make it happen. Whereas Tom Morello, who's awesome, I'm not putting him down, I think he found sounds and then found ways to incorporate them into what he was doing. And those are two cool things, but I think they're different things.
No, I agree with that analogy, Rob. I guess it would have been different. Yeah. And I love Tom, and I interviewed him a couple times, and very talented guy, and again, I don't know a lot about Tom Morello, but I suppose it would have been different had Tom Morello created the little switch thing that allowed him to, you know what I mean? It's like Edward was an inventor. Tom, is a technician, par excellence. But Ed was, inventing these things. I mean, that's, and they're talking to him, about, building a guitar, and, well, it's not that hard, man. You just put the neck on. Yeah, right. You just put the neck on. Yeah, like, I mean, look, man, for guys like you or guys that are around woodworking and you're used to doing that stuff, maybe, but to me, it's such an art, and the fact that what he was creating was resonating so much with other people. I mean, that's such a rare thing. And again, I write about it in the book, and I've tried to think of other guitar players who I can recall who have built their own guitars and played their own guitars. The only two people I can think of, and they both figure in Edward's life, and I talk about them in the book, is Brian May and Les Paul. Name me another guitar player who's built his own guitar and played it. Yep. Right? I mean, there must be others. I can't think of them, but so that's a rare fraternity, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you ever have experiences in which, because I'm a bootleg collector, I go deep. I'm always looking on eBay for things. I just found a Live in '77 CD, and then it was in Tokyo in '89. But like, it fascinates me, so when the David Lee Roth reunion record came out, a lot of those tunes were stuff that had been from the very beginning, and it was reworked. Did you ever experience him like in 5150 or just in general noodling on something, or just a riff that was stuck in his head that years later you're like, holy crap, that became that? Did that ever happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, and again, I write about that. Well, I suppose it's a little different. When Edward comes over to Weepaw Way, I'm there with my buddy Ron, and we're working on one of my songs, and Ron's a very talented guy, keyboard player and bass player. And Edward comes over and he starts, playing this little riff. He picks up my guitar and he's playing a riff, and he's kind of shouting out changes to Ron what to play, and I think it's some running D minor riff, and I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty cool, and then realizing that was and I got to get my chronology right. Best of Both Worlds. I don't remember the exact song it was, but there's another time when I'm at a NAMM. Sorry, when I was I went and hung out with the band with Sammy Hagar in Chicago, and I read about that. That was that Guitar World interview. And I'm back in Edward's room, and he's playing this riff over and over. I will bet you $1 million that riff ultimately showed up on an album. I wish I could remember it. I'm sure that stuff that he was playing showed up somewhere down the road in a song. It was a riff or a solo thing. Because I don't think that Ed... I mean, look, he obviously messed around and noodled around, but his noodling, I always think, was a little more directed. I always think his noodling was always thinking about how this could work in a song, thinking about it as the next riff in a song, thinking about it as the beginning of a solo. So it's not like Ed would sit down and run scales or, I mean, he just didn't do stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, he was always playing so much. I mean, I wish I could remember more of that stuff, because I'm sure some of that stuff would have ended up on records later on.
Yeah, I mean, I have read articles about the archives of all the tapes at 5150, and like they're baking them. Wolfgang's baking them because the tape needs to get like brought back to life, and there must be such cool stuff that is just sitting there. I mean, a video just came out a couple years ago that was from like '87, and it's him playing like a pretty complete version of the song Amsterdam, which was on the Balance record, which
Yeah,
was,
I remember that video.
8 years later. It's like, holy crap, that was there, and it just never happened. And, you know, just selfishly, and I know this is never going to happen, but when that Best of record came out in 95, and it had the 2 new songs with David Lee Roth, and it's why Sammy Hagar left the band, I guess. I really loved, because this is when I'm first getting into playing guitar. I'm like 13 then. I loved those new David Lee Roth songs. And one of them has been well documented, was a song that had been written for Balance that never finished, and there was an instrumental of it around. I would love to hear like what Sammy was trying to do with that, but whatever, that's just my nerdy stuff.
No, that's interesting. Again, I write about Sammy in the book, and things that happened, and those archives. I never saw the actual 2-inch or whatever Ed was using. I'm sure it was 2-inch archives, but I did see the boxes and boxes and boxes of cassettes. Because Ed would record everything on cassette. So my God, on cassette, I mean, there's thousands of cassettes. I mean, getting the frame here, just crazy stuff. I mean, I'm sure there's some amazing stuff in there that there has to be, of course. And maybe it will see the light of day one day.
Be pretty cool.
Be
cool.
And it's funny, Rob, because I know a lot of people who really dug those 2 David Lee Roth songs. And I think even Ed was really pleased with them, because again, I write about, trying to find the song for Dave, and Dave, but Ed bringing in those other writers as well. I can't remember his name. Sorry. I mean, he has some other very talented writers participating in those songs as well. So,
right.
Yeah.
There's a lot riding on him, and then it didn't really do anything until 10 years later, but it's all good, man. This, so where can people get this? Because I have a fun little activity I want to do at the end, but before we wrapped off, so I got this on Reverb. Is that where are people supposed to?
Did you really?
I did.
Of course.
I did.
Where else would Rob's School of Music get my book than on Reverb? That's funny. It is available on Reverb. It's available on Amazon, eBay, and Etsy. I think Etsy, I've sold 3 copies. I thought, what the hell, put it up on Etsy.
Why not?
Somebody buying a homemade purse is going to buy my Van Halen book, right? And it's also available on my own website, which I had put together. And that address is tonechaserbook.com.
Hagar or Roth?
Oh my God.
And I asked that to everyone, but I feel like it's extra pertinent here.
Yeah. Look, I've written about Dave and Sammy in the book, of course. I was never a huge fan of Dave's. I cannot discount what he created and his importance in the band. And Sammy, I think technically Sammy was a better singer, but, and this is going to get me in trouble, I've never been a big Sammy Hagar fan. I mean, he's a very good singer. He's not the kind of singer I would listen to. I mean, when I think of singers, I think of Paul Rodgers or Roger Daltrey. I mean, and again, that goes back to the era I grew up in, and that's what I was listening to. If I had to choose one, I suppose I would choose Dave, because that was the era when Edward was happiest. Those are the earlier days. So yeah, that's why I would probably give Dave my vote there. So
that's all good. I mean, that question is loaded because they both put out, from strictly a musical perspective, they both put out great music. Like I mentioned to you, I think before we started, my first Van Halen show was the Gary Cherone tour, and Gary Cherone sang both singers, and he had great stage presence. And to me, I would argue with friends growing up that, as sacrilegious as it was, I'm getting to see 3/4 of Van Halen and then a guy up there who can sing like both guys. So it's about the songs. And
real quick, and I know you got to jump here, Rob, probably. I like that Gary Shalom record. Yeah, man.
Me too.
I thought he was a great singer. I thought lyrically it was really interesting. I guess some things went wrong, and the record didn't happen the way Edward was hoping it would, or Warner's or whatever. But yeah, I mean, look, but then Edward's tone had changed, But yeah, I thought Gary was a really, really good singer, and I'd interviewed Gary after the fact, and yeah, very cool guy, and yeah, great singer actually. And I loved his lyrics. So
yeah,
who knows, man? Who knows? Right.
It's all good, man. It's good music. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you. Everyone, be sure to check out the book. I promise you, if you're a Van Halen fan, a music fan, a guitar player, just someone who's curious about an important part of our history culturally, this is a book you got to check out. So I keep finding where the camera's there. Thank you, Steve.
Rob, thank you so much. And so, Rob, if I get your shred book, am I going to play like you?
So actually, completely. So this book is not even a music education book. This is more like a self-help book. So this book, Shreds, is 20% stories from me, like 20% stories from my experience, 30% music education, but super topical, like chromatic scale and choose inspiration over intimidation. The remaining 50% is teaching you how to learn, how to practice. It's a way to live your life almost. And then it connects music as sort of a lifestyle. That's kind of the thing. Confusing title, but it's cool. I'll get you a copy. I'll send one over.
I'd love to have a copy, man.
All right, cool. We'll connect on email. I'll send it over.
Excellent.
All right, brother. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Be
Rob.
good. All right.